The day I found the envelope, I was looking for a pen. That is it. That is the whole reason I know the truth now. I was not snooping. I was not suspicious. I was not even having a bad day. I just needed a pen from the drawer in my father-in-law's study, and the envelope was sitting right there with my name crossed out in red ink and my sister-in-law's name written above it. Not taped shut, not hidden, just sitting there like it meant nothing, like I meant nothing. I stood in that room for 4 minutes without moving. I know because I checked my phone when I finally came back to myself. My hands were shaking. The paper inside the envelope was a revised inheritance document, signed and dated 11 days after my husband and I got married. 11 days. And what I found when I kept reading was not just a financial betrayal. It was a blueprint. A carefully planned, years-long decision that my husband's family had made about me before I ever had a chance to become part of them. And the worst part, the part that broke something deep inside me, was that my husband had signed it too. Before I tell you everything, I need to ask you something. If the person who was supposed to protect you was the one who quietly signed your name away, what would hurt more, the money, or the fact that they smiled at you every single day and said nothing? Think about that while you listen. And if you have ever loved someone who turned out to be a stranger in a familiar face, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop a comment when you realize the moment Nadia should have known. I want to see if you catch it before she did. My name is Nadia, and I want to start by telling you who I was before all of this happened, because it matters. Not because I need your pity, but because you need to understand the kind of person I was in order to feel what it meant when the people I loved most decided I was not worth telling the truth to. I was the kind of woman who showed up, always. If someone needed a meal cooked, I cooked it. If someone needed a ride at midnight, I was already putting on my shoes. I was raised to believe that love is not a feeling you wait around for. It is a decision you make every single morning. And I made that decision every morning for 12 years inside a marriage and a family that was counting the days until they no longer needed me. I grew up in a small city. My parents were not wealthy people, but they were honest people. My mother used to say that a clean conscience is the only inheritance worth leaving. I thought about that a lot in the months after I found the envelope. I thought about how different that belief was from the one held by the family I had married into. My husband's name is Rayan. When I met him, he was warm and steady and full of plans. He talked about building a life together in a way that made you feel like the future was already safe. He had a big family, a mother named Nadia, a father named Kareem, and a younger sister named Sana. They welcomed me with food and warmth and hugs at the door. His mother called me daughter from the first month. His father shook my father's hand and said our family is your family now. I believed every word. We got married on a warm evening in October. Rayan cried when he saw me walk in. His mother held my hand during the reception and told me I was the best thing that had ever walked into their home. I remember thinking that I had never felt so held by a group of people in my life. I remember thinking this is what it feels like to gain a family. 11 days after our wedding, they sat down without me and changed a document. I did not know that then, of course. I was still in the early glow of being a new bride, unpacking boxes in the apartment we had rented, learning Rayan's habits, cooking for two for the first time, building something. I had no idea that while I was doing all of that, his family was undoing something else entirely. The first 2 years of our marriage were good on the surface. We visited his parents every Friday. I helped Nadia in the kitchen every time. I brought gifts. I remembered birthdays. I drove Sana to her university exams twice when her car broke down. I sat with Kareem when he had a health scare and the whole family was too afraid to stay in the hospital room for long stretches. I stayed. I always stayed. What I did not notice at the time was how certain conversations stopped when I walked into the room. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make you suspicious right away, just a subtle lowering of voices. A topic that changed. A document slid into a folder before I could see it. Small things that I explained away with very reasonable explanations, because when you love people and trust them and they have called you daughter and family, you build generous explanations for everything. I told myself Nadia was private about money because she grew up without it. I told myself Kareem was quiet about his land properties because he was all D, fashioned and believed men handled finances alone. I told myself Sana was cold toward me because she was young and adjusting to not being the only woman Rayan loved anymore. I built these explanations like little fences around every uncomfortable feeling, and I stayed behind them. The envelope changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th year of our marriage. Rayan was at work. I was at his parents' house because Dalia had asked me to help her reorganize the storage room. This was normal. I was there all the time. Kareem's study was just down the hall from the storage room, and I needed a pen to label some boxes, and his door was open, and I walked in. The envelope was on the edge of his desk. It was not sealed. The top flap was folded loosely inside, like someone had been reviewing it recently. My name was printed on the front, Nadia Al-Rashed, which was my married name, but it was crossed out. One thick red line through my name, and above it, in neat handwriting, was Sana's name. I pulled out the document inside. It took me a moment to understand what I was reading, because legal language is not always clear the first time. But once I understood the structure of it, my whole chest went cold. It was a revised family trust document. Kareem's estate, which included 2 properties, a business share, and a savings fund accumulated over decades, had originally named Rayan and Nadia jointly as beneficiaries alongside Sana. The original document, which I had never seen but which apparently existed, had been drafted before our wedding as part of a verbal agreement between Kareem and Rayan. The revised document removed my name entirely. It replaced my portion with an equal addition to Sana's share. The revision was dated 11 days after our wedding. The signature at the bottom was Kareem's. The witness signature beside it was Rayan's. My husband had witnessed the document that erased me, and then he had come home and held my hand and told me the future was safe. I folded the document back into the envelope. I placed it exactly where I had found it. I walked back down the hall. I picked up the roll of labels from the storage room, and then I told Dalia I had a headache and went home. I did not say anything to Rayan that night. I sat across from him at dinner and listened to him talk about his day and nodded in the right places and said very little. He did not notice. That itself was information. I need you to understand what those first few days felt like after finding that document, because it was not anger right away. Anger came later. The first feeling was a kind of vertigo, like the floor of every memory had suddenly dropped away and you were standing in the air. Every warm dinner with his family. Every time Dalia called me daughter. Every birthday gift I had picked out carefully. Every hour I had spent in that hospital room with Kareem. All of it felt like it was floating in a new context, and the new context made it all look different. I started paying attention differently. Not in an obvious way. I did not go through phones or demand explanations. I simply started listening to the edges of conversations instead of the center. I started noticing what was not said. I started tracking patterns. Within 2 weeks, I had noticed 3 things that I had been successfully not noticing for 4 years. The first was that whenever Kareem mentioned his properties, casually, in passing, he only ever spoke about who would take care of them after him, and that person was always either Rayan or Sana. Never both of us. Never Rayan and Nadia. Always just Rayan, as if I were a guest in a conversation about my own household. The second was that Sana treated me differently than she treated her own friends or cousins who visited. She was polite, always polite, but there was a careful distance to her politeness, like someone who is being kind to a person they know will eventually leave. At the time, I had explained this as shyness or sibling adjustment. Sitting with it now, it felt more like knowledge, like she already knew something about my position in this family that I did not. The third thing I noticed was the most painful. Rayan, my husband, the man I had built my days around for 4 years, had never once in those 4 years mentioned the word inheritance in any conversation that included me. Not once. We had spoken about our future. We had spoken about children, about buying our own home eventually, about growing older together. But the financial foundation of his family, a foundation I now knew included properties and business shares and a trust fund, had simply never come up in any real way when I was present. I had thought this was modesty or privacy. I now understood it was management. I had been managed. Once that word appeared in my mind, I could not make it leave. I had been managed. My presence in the family had been welcomed warmly and publicly, and then quietly fenced off at the finank. Aisle level, and my husband had helped build that fence, and for 4 years I had been cheerfully painting the outside of it, and believing it was just a wall someone else had put up. I made a decision in those 2 weeks. I would not explode. I would not confront. I would not give anyone the chance to minimize what I had seen, to tell me I had misread it, to shift the story to my reaction instead of their action. I would gather more. I would understand the full shape of what had been done before I made a single move. This decision, more than anything else, was what eventually protected me. I quietly called my cousin Hessa, who was a legal consultant. Not a full attorney, but someone who understood documents and could explain what I had seen without me having to go to a stranger. I met her for coffee and I described the document in detail, the structure, the date, the signatures, the change in beneficiaries. I did not yet have a copy. I had been too careful to photograph it that first day, because something in me had wanted to stay calm and not yet treat my husband's family as an enemy. Hessa listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "Nadia, a revised trust document witnessed by the spouse 11 days after marriage is not a coincidence. That is a plan." A plan. I had spent 4 years thinking I was building a life. Apparently, someone had spent those same 4 years executing a plan. I went back to Kareem's house 3 days later on a normal Friday visit. I helped in the kitchen. I laughed at the right times. I poured tea for Kareem and asked about his health. And when Delia asked me to carry some folders from the study to the storage room, I said yes with a smile, and I took my time in the study, and I photographed every page of the revised document with my phone, quickly and clearly, before carrying the folders out. I had the document now. Hessa reviewed the photographs that same evening. She confirmed the structure, a family trust, legitimate, witnessed, revised with full legal weight. She also pointed out something I had not fully registered when I first read it. The original version, the one made before the wedding, had not only included my name as a joint beneficiary with Rayan. It had included a specific clause granting me independent claim to a portion of the estate in the event of a separation. That clause was gone in the revision. So it was not just that they had removed me from the inheritance. They had removed the specific protection that would have existed for me if the marriage ever fell apart. They had revised the document to make sure that no matter what happened, whether I stayed or whether I eventually left, I would walk away with nothing that had ever been theirs. I sat with that information for a long time. Hessa gave me a list of things to consider, not instructions, not a battle plan, just a list of things that a woman in my position might want to understand. Whether any verbal agreements about the original trust had ever been made to me directly. Whether I had any records of conversations where the original arrangement had been referenced. Whether my name appeared anywhere in writing in relation to Rayan's family assets. I went through 4 years of messages, emails, voice notes. I was thorough and I was calm because the anger had settled into something quieter and harder, like stone. I found one thing that mattered enormously. 18 months into our marriage, during a conversation about buying a house, Kareem had sent Rayan a message in a family group chat that included me. The message said, "When we transfer the Jeddah property, it will go to you and Nadia jointly. Make sure you both have your documents ready." I had seen that message at the time and had felt a small, warm feeling about belonging, about being included, about the future being solid. I had not screenshotted it because I had no reason to. But it was still there in the chat history, and I screenshotted it now. Kareem, in writing, had referenced my joint inclusion in a property transfer. And then 11 days after my wedding, he had signed a document removing me from exactly that kind of arrangement. That message was a paper trail, small but real. Hessa said it was useful. Not decisive, but useful. It showed a pattern of representation versus private action. It showed that I had been led to believe one thing while a different plan was being executed. I had enough to understand what had been done. Now, I had to decide what to do with that understanding. This is where I want to be very honest about something, because I think it is important. My first instinct was not revenge. My first instinct was grief. I lay on my side of the bed that night and looked at the back of Rayan's head while he slept, and I felt something so heavy it was almost physical. Not rage, just loss. Grief for T. He marriage I had believed in. Grief for the mother-in-law who had called me daughter while quietly counting me out. Grief for the version of my own life I had been building in my imagination, which had been built on a foundation that someone else had already decided was not mine. I grieved for about 2 weeks, quietly, completely, and then I got very clear. I told no one in his family what I knew. I told no one in my own family either, except Hessa, because I did not want anyone else's emotion to interfere with my thinking. I began to observe my marriage with new eyes. Not bitter eyes, clear eyes. I wanted to understand whether the financial deception was connected to other things, or whether it was an isolated decision made by his parents that Rayan had gone along with under pressure. What I found over the next few months answered that question in a way I had not expected. I started noticing how Rayan talked about money. We had a joint account for household expenses, and I contributed equally from my salary. But the bigger financial decisions, savings, investments, anything above a certain amount, Rayan always handled alone. I had never pushed back on this because he presented it as efficiency. He said he had more experience managing numbers. I had accepted that because I trusted him, and because I had not yet had reason to question his financial transparency. I started looking more carefully at our bank statements. What I found was not dramatic at first. Small amounts. Transfers I did not recognize. Not large enough to be alarming in isolation, but consistent enough to form a pattern. Once a month, sometimes twice, a transfer would leave our joint household account and go to an account I did not recognize. When I searched the account details through our banking app, the recipient name that appeared was one I recognized instantly. Sana. My husband had been transferring money from our shared household account to his sister every single month. Not once, not occasionally, every month. For at least the 2 years of bank history I could scroll back through. The amounts ranged from a few hundred to just above 1,000. Over 2 years, added together, the total was significant. Not catastrophic, but significant, and it had come from money that was equally mine. I did not say anything. I documented everything. I took screenshots of every transfer. I created a folder on my personal laptop, password protected, with the trust document photographs, the group chat screenshot, and now the bank transfer records. I built a file, quietly, calmly, without anyone knowing. Hessa reviewed the transfer records when I showed her. She pointed out that transfers from a joint marital account to a third party without the other account holder's knowledge or consent was not a small thing, legally speaking. It was a misuse of shared funds. Combined with the trust document situation, it began to paint a picture that was not about one bad decision made under family pressure. It was about a deliberate and sustained pattern of keeping me financially excluded and financially drained within the very marriage that was supposed to be my safe place. My husband was not a victim of his parents' planning. He was participating in it. That realization arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in my car outside a grocery store. I remember the exact moment because the world outside, the windshield looked exactly the same as it always had, and I felt completely different inside, like a switch had turned somewhere that would never turn back. I went home, I cooked dinner, I sat across from Rayan, I smiled, I said very little. Inside, I had already begun to move. I opened my own personal bank account the following week. I had always had one. I had never closed my pre-marriage account, but I had let it sit nearly empty because most of my salary went into the joint account. I stopped depositing my full salary into the joint account. I redirected 60% of it to my personal account and only deposited the remaining 40% into the joint account, which still covered my share of the bills. I did this quietly, without announcement, and Rayan did not notice for a full 6 weeks. I also began speaking to a family law consultant on Hess's recommendation, not to file anything, not to make any public move, just to understand my position, just to know the full shape of the field I was standing on. What I learned in those consultations was sobering and clarifying at the same time. My legal position was not as weak as his family's planning had tried to make it. The misuse of joint funds could be challenged. The trust document revision, while legally valid, did not erase my claims as a spouse under marital property laws depending on how things progressed. The group chat message from Karim was not decisive on its own, but was evidence of a representation made to me. My situation was not hopeless. It was, in fact, more protected than they had intended. This was the moment I felt something shift from grief into something else entirely. Not revenge, not anger. Something more like the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the door they had tried to close was not as locked as they thought. Around this time, about 6 months after I found the envelope, something happened that I had not planned for. Dalia got sick. Not terminally, but seriously enough to require surgery and a recovery period. And in the way that illness sometimes strips away the careful performance of normal life, the weeks around Dalia's surgery revealed several things I had not been able to see clearly before. The first was how the family communicated under stress. Rayan's family became a tight, closed unit during the crisis. Every decision was made in conversations that happened before I was called. Every plan was formed and then presented to me as complete, with my only expected role being practical help, driving, cooking, sitting with Dalia during recovery hours. I was useful. I was not included. In every organizational meeting about Dalia's care, I sat slightly outside the circle, not pushed out dramatically, just, not pulled in. I watched Sana take notes. I watched Karim and Rayan lean toward each other and speak in low voices. I watched my mother-in-law, even from her hospital bed, address every conversation primarily to her children, with an occasional warm glance toward me that felt more like manners than connection. The second thing I saw during the crisis was Sana. At one point, while Dalia was resting and Karim had stepped out and Rayan was on a phone call, Sana and I were alone in the hospital room together for the first time in a long time. We talked a little small things about the surgery, about the recovery plan. And then Sana said something that she clearly meant as a comfort. She said, "You know, my mother really does care about you, Nadia. She just wants to make sure the family stays protected." Family stays protected. From what I wanted to ask, from me, what exactly was I a threat to? But I did not ask. I nodded and said I knew, and I tucked that sentence into the folder in my mind where I kept everything I had learned. What Sana said confirmed something I had been gradually understanding. The family's decisions about me were not about disliking me personally. They were about protection of assets. I was an outsider who had married their son and brother, and to them, an outsider with claims was a risk. The warm welcome, the mother-daughter language, the holiday gifts and hugs, all of it was real in the sense that they were not cruel people. But underneath the warmth was a boundary they had drawn before I ever arrived. And they had made sure that boundary was legally reinforced 11 days after my wedding. Dalia recovered. Life returned to its surface calm. I returned to my quiet process. Approximately 8 months after finding the envelope, I learned something new that had nothing to do with documents or bank accounts. It came from a woman named Khalid, who was a neighbor of Rayan's parents and who had known the family for almost 20 years. I had always liked Khalid. She was warm and unfiltered in a way that older women in tight-knit communities sometimes are. She said what she thought. She remembered everything, and she had no investment in keeping appearances. She came to visit Dalia during the recovery period, and I happened to be there alone when she arrived, since Rayan and his parents had gone to a follow-up appointment. We sat together and drank tea, and she talked about the neighborhood, and she talked about Dalia, and then, because Khalid did not filter herself, she said something that landed like a stone in still water. She said, "You know, when Rayan was first going to marry you, Karim was not happy. He wanted Rayan to wait and find someone whose family had something to bring in. Your family is good people, God bless them, but Kareem always said he did not want any outside claims on what he had built. She said it casually, like it was old news, like she assumed I already knew. I held my teacup and kept my face calm and asked, gently, what changed Kareem's mind. She said, Rayan wore him down, the boy loves you. But they made an agreement, those two. I do not know the details, but I know there was an agreement. Kareem always said he would welcome you, but the property stays clean. The property stays clean. That phrase, that exact phrase, it answered the question I had been sitting with for 8 months. It told me that this was not a private family arrangement that Rayan had been pressured into without understanding. It was an agreement between Rayan and his father, made before our wedding, as a condition of being allowed to marry me. My husband had agreed to erase my financial future before he ever put the ring on my finger. I finished my tea with Khalid. I thanked her. I drove home. I sat in the parking garage below our apartment for 40 minutes. I did not cry. I was far past the point where crying was what my body wanted to do. What I felt was something colder and more precise. A complete understanding. A full picture. After 8 months of careful observation and documentation, I now had the shape of the entire thing, from beginning to present. Before our wedding, an agreement between Rayan and Kareem to welcome me into the family while protecting the estate from any claims I might make. 11 days after our wedding, the legal execution of that agreement, with Rayan's signature as witness. Throughout our marriage, monthly financial transfers from our joint account to Sana, without my knowledge. Throughout our marriage, a deliberate exclusion from any real financial conversation, managed through the language of privacy and efficiency. In writing, 18 months in, a message from Kareem that represented a joint future to me, while the private legal reality said something entirely different. This was not a mistake. This was not pressure. This was a long and deliberate design. And the person who had held my hand at our wedding, who had cried when he saw me walk in, who had told me the future was safe, that person had been part of the design from the very beginning. I made an appointment with a proper family law attorney the following week, not for emotional reasons, for practical ones. I needed to understand what legal options existed, what my timeline looked like, and what actions I needed to take to protect myself before any of this became public. My attorney, a composed woman named Rima who had been practicing family law for over 15 years, reviewed everything I had. The trust document photographs, the bank transfer records, the group chat screenshot, and the notes I had written from my conversation with Khalid. She was quiet for a long time after going through the materials. Then she said, "You have been very careful. That is in your favor." She explained my options. She explained what she could pursue, what the timeline would look like, what I needed to preserve. She explained that the misuse of joint funds was the clearest and most immediately actionable issue. She explained that my claim as a spouse under marital property rights had not been fully eliminated by the trust revision, contrary to what his family may have assumed. She also said something I found quietly powerful. She said, "In my experience, when families make these kinds of arrangements, they expect the other person to either never find out or to be too overwhelmed to act when they do. They rely on your disorientation. Your documentation removes that advantage. Your documentation removes that advantage." I went home that evening and I thought about the version of me who had walked into Kareem's study looking for a pen. That woman had not been looking for any of this. She had just needed a pen, and the universe had handed her an envelope instead. I began the legal process quietly. My attorney sent a formal letter of representation to Rayan's family attorney, not a demand, not a threat. Simply a formal notification that I was legally represented and that certain financial matters were being reviewed. It was a professional letter, measured, calm. The reaction on Rayan's side was not calm. He came home 2 evenings after the letter was received, and he was visibly shaken. He sat down at the kitchen table before I had said a word, and he said, "Nadia, what have you done?" Those 3 words told me everything about how he had framed this in his mind. Not what have we allowed to happen, not what has my family done, What have you done? As if I were the one who had taken an action against him, rather than he being someone who had taken an action against me years ago and simply been discovered. I sat down across from him and I said, very calmly, I hired a lawyer to help me understand my financial situation. What specifically concerns you about that? He was flustered. He started talking quickly, about how this would hurt the family, about how his parents would be devastated, about how there was no need for legal involvement, about how we could talk about everything privately. He said his father had only been trying to protect what he had worked for, and that it had nothing to do with how they felt about me personally. He said Sana needed the money more because of her circumstances. He said the transfers to Sana were loans, not gifts, and that he had meant to tell me. He said he had meant to tell me. I looked at my husband, this man I had shared a bed with for 5 years, this man I had cooked for and driven for and stayed in hospitals for and built my daily life around, and I felt very little. Not nothing, but very little. What I felt most was a kind of tired clarity. The clarity of a woman who had known, for several months, exactly what she was dealing with and who had prepared for exactly this conversation. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I asked him 3 simple questions. Did he know about the trust document revision before he signed it as witness? Yes or no? Did he know that money was being transferred from our joint account to Sana each month? Yes or no? Had he made any agreement with his father about my financial exclusion before our wedding? Yes or no? He could not answer any of the 3 questions with a direct no. He stuttered and explained and gave context and said things were more complicated than they appeared. But he did not say no to any of them. That conversation, his inability to deny any of the 3 facts I had directly asked about, was, in its own way, a kind of confession. Not a legal one, not a dramatic one, but a real one. I told him I needed time to think. I went to my mother's house and I stayed there for a week. During that week, his family called me 3 times. Delia called, crying, saying she loved me and that I was misunderstanding everything, and that the family just needed to talk together. Kareem called once, more formal, saying that legal involvement was unnecessary and that he was open to a family discussion. Sana did not call, which I noted. My attorney told me not to respond to any family communications while the process was underway. I followed her guidance exactly. At my mother's house, I finally told my parents the shape of what had happened. Not every detail, but enough. My mother's face went very still when I explained the trust document. My father did not speak for almost a full minute. Then he said, "We trusted them with you." 4 words, and they broke me open in a way that nothing in the previous 8 months had fully broken me. Not the document, not the transfers, not Rayan's stuttered non-denials. My father saying we trusted them with you, because he was right. He had walked me down the aisle into a family that had already, 11 days before, decided to build walls around everything they owned so that I could never be a full part of it. I let myself cry that night, properly, finally, completely. And then the next morning I woke up and I was still Nadia. Still the woman who showed up. Still the woman who did the careful work. Except now I was doing the careful work for myself. The legal process moved forward over the following months. My attorney filed a formal claim regarding the misuse of joint marital funds, the transfers to Sana over 2 years. This was the clearest actionable matter. Rayan, through his own attorney, initially denied that the transfers constituted misuse. He maintained that they were loans and that I had implicitly consented by not objecting. My attorney submitted the bank records showing 2 years of consistent monthly transfers. She submitted the fact that I had never been informed of any loan agreement between Rayan and Sana. She submitted my testimony that I had not consented. Rayan's attorney went quiet for several days after the records were submitted. Then came the settlement offer. It was not what I deserved, but it was real. Rayan's side offered to return the full amount of the transfers to my personal account, acknowledge in writing that the transfers had occurred without my knowledge, and agree to a formal separation of our joint financial account with an equitable division of the current balance. My attorney advised me to accept this as a first step, which I did. The money was returned to my account within 3 weeks. The written acknowledgement was signed. It was not justice in the full sense, but it was accountability, real, documented financial accountability. And for a family that had believed I would never know and never act, it was a meaningful consequence. Rayan and I were officially separated by the time the settlement was finalized. He moved back to his parents' house. I stayed in the apartment, which I could afford on my own salary with the redirected account. I had been preparing for this possibility for months, and the preparation meant that I was not scrambling. I was steady. The divorce process was its own chapter, and it was painful in ways that had nothing to do with strategy or documentation. It was painful in the way that ending a life you had imagined is always painful, no matter how right the ending is. I grieved during the divorce process. I did not pretend otherwise. Grief and clarity can exist at the same time. During the divorce process, my attorney raised the trust document as a relevant matter. Specifically, the original version that had included me, the revision 11 days after the wedding, and the group chat message from Karim that had represented a future joint property arrangement. These matters did not become the center of the divorce proceedings, but they were on record. They were known. Rayan's family knew that I knew, and that my attorney knew, and that the representation made in that group chat message was documented. Karim contacted my father directly during this period. This surprised me when I found my father told me about the call calmly, without drama. Karim had called to say that the family had no ill will toward me, that the trust decisions were simply about protecting what he had built, and that he hoped the divorce could be handled with dignity. My father listened, and then he said, "You should have protected her from the beginning. You called her daughter." Karim did not respond to that. The call ended shortly after. My father's words were not a legal argument. They were not part of any strategy, but they were the truest things said in that entire process. You called her daughter. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in a meeting room that smelled like old paper. I signed the documents. My attorney shook my hand. I drove to a cafe, and I sat alone, and I ordered tea, and I watched the street outside for about an hour without thinking about anything in particular. I was 33 years old. I had been married for 5 years. I had spent 8 months carefully understanding what had been done to me and building the documentation to name it and face it. And now it was done. Not perfectly, not with every injustice resolved, but done. And I was the one who had done it, and I was still standing. In the months after the divorce, several people on Rayan's side of things tried to reach me in various ways. A cousin of his sent me a message saying she was sorry and that she had always liked me. I thanked her and did not continue the conversation. Dalia sent a long voice note through a mutual contact. I did not listen to it. I simply saved it and moved on. Sana, who had never called during the entire crisis, sent a message about 2 months after the divorce was finalized. It said simply, "I hope you are okay." I did not respond to Sana. What I want to say about the aftermath is this. No one came back with a full admission. No one called to say we were wrong and we are sorry and we should have done differently. People rarely do. What came back instead was softened language, regret-adjacent feelings, the suggestion that things had been complicated, the implication that if I had just talked to them, we could have worked it out, as if the problem were a miscommunication rather than a decision. As if the envelope with my name, crossed out in red, were simply a misunderstanding. I did not need the admission. I had spent a long time believing I needed people to acknowledge what they had done in order for me to be okay. The months of building my file and protecting myself had taught me something important. Acknowledgement from the people who hurt you is not what frees you. Understanding what happened, naming it clearly, and taking action based on that understanding, that is what frees you. I moved into a smaller apartment closer to my own family. My mother came over on the first evening and she brought food and she helped me unpack and she did not say much, just worked alongside me. And at one point she looked around the space and she said, "This is yours, all of it." This is yours, all of it. I thought about what she had said for a long time afterward. She did not mean it only about the apartment. She meant it about my life, about the decisions I would make from here, About the mornings I would wake up and not spend managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. I started building differently after that. I took on more at work. I had been careful at work for years, keeping my professional life from overlapping with the tension at home, which had meant playing small in some ways, not wanting too much attention or success to create conversations I was not ready to have. I stopped playing small. Within a year, I had taken on a project management role that doubled my responsibilities and my salary. I started spending time with women I had quietly drifted away from during my marriage years. The reconnections were slow and warm and good. I had been lonely in ways I had not admitted during the marriage, because when you are busy performing normalcy, you do not always notice the shape of your own loneliness. I started allowing myself to have opinions about things again. Small things, big things. What to eat, where to go, what to want, what to refuse. I had been so careful for so long about not wanting too much, about not being too much, about not making the delicate balance of my position in that family more complicated than it already was, without even knowing I was doing it. Without even knowing there was a balance to maintain, because I had not known the terms. I am telling you this not because it ends perfectly. Life does not end perfectly. I tell you this because I need you to understand what it means to be the person who was chosen warmly, welcomed loudly, and excluded quietly. I need you to understand what it costs to stay and give and trust inside a structure that was designed, from before the beginning, to make sure you never truly owned your place in it. And I need you to understand that the person who finds the envelope is not always looking for it. Sometimes the truth just puts itself in your path and asks you, "What will you do with me?" What I did with it was this: I documented, I learned, I protected myself, I acted with calm, I endured the discomfort of not confronting immediately, I let the grief be real, I let the anger be real, and then I used both of them as fuel for something quiet and lasting. I did not scream. I did not perform a confrontation for the satisfaction of an audience. I did not wait for them to admit anything. I gathered what I needed, I built what I needed, and I walked into my own life with both hands. That is what quiet strength looks like. Not the absence of pain, not the absence of grief, not the absence of fury, but the decision to channel all of it into something that actually protects you. I want to say one more thing before I close. There will be people who hear this story and say that Rayan must have loved me, that his family must have been afraid of something, that surely there is more context, that families do complicated things under pressure, and it does not mean they are bad people. I want to say, you may be right. They were not cartoonishly evil. They were afraid of losing what they had built, and in that fear, they drew a circle around their assets and put me outside of it with a smile on their faces. But here is what I know. Love that excludes you from the start is not a different kind of love. It is something else. It may be real affection. It may be real warmth. But it is not the love that calls you daughter and means it all the way down. And I deserved the love that meant it all the way down. I know that now. My name is Nadia. I needed a pen. I found an envelope. And then I found my way back to myself. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Not about the legal steps or the revenge or the documents. I want to know, when was the last time you made yourself small to keep someone else comfortable? When was the last time you excused something because the explanation you built was easier than the truth? Nadia did not set out to find betrayal. She set out to find a pen. Sometimes that is all it takes, one ordinary moment, and suddenly you cannot unsee the thing you have been walking past for years. If this found you at the right moment, leave a comment. Tell me what part hit the hardest. And if someone in your life needs to hear that their name deserves to stay on the document, share this with them. Without a word. They will understand.